Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are going to be facilitating an off-campus small group through Dayspring's ministry. If you're leading a group of adults off-campus and you're facilitating that group meeting on the week of September the 13th, this video is designed to help you get ready to do that. So let's look at the guide that you have, the one that your group uses each week. You should have a copy of that by now, dated September the 13th. I'm going to walk through it with you. Maybe give you some things to think about and some ideas to discuss with your group that might make facilitating your group time a little easier. So let's look at it together. It begins in discussion point number 1 by pointing you to the passage from Sunday's message. And discussion point number 1 is all about getting the ball rolling and hearing people talk about what they digested from the sermon. So do your best to lead them in that discussion. And boy, oh boy, you should have a lot to talk about this week, okay? And this may be one of those ones where you really get hung up on discussion point number 1 for a long time, but I always say if the discussion from the Sunday sermon is meaningful and people are really plowing deep into what they heard and learned and processing that deeper, don't stop it. Your goal is not to finish the sheet necessarily. Your goal is, as a group, to grow deeper in your relationship with God by exploring the Scripture together. So if discussion point number 1 kind of lingers on, but it's good and it's significant and substantial, let it roll, which means you may have to look at your handout ahead of time and say, okay, if that goes long, where do I want to jump to next on the guide? Go ahead and have that plan ready. But discussion point number 1 gets you started by kind of rehashing what you heard and learned Sunday. Now, let me tell you this. The sermon is going to talk about how we tend to just follow our hearts. And in fact, if you think about it, that's probably a bit of trusted advice that you've given before or received when making decisions. People have probably told you before, well, listen, just listen to your heart. Your heart's not going to lead you astray, those sort of things. This discussion you're about to get into talks about that advice and how really that's not good advice. It's really not good advice at all. So let's look at your discussion points. Discussion point number 2, it says, it seems that a trusted piece of advice that we give and receive is this: just listen to your heart and follow what it tells you. Now look at the questions afterwards. It says, can you think of an instance where you listened to your heart and it got you in trouble? And can you think of an instance where you ignored your heart and that got you in trouble? Now, you as a group facilitator, go ahead and try and think of a couple of examples of that, because that's one of those questions you may have to think about for a while before you can answer. So you may need to go ahead and have the answers to those questions. But here's the point that you're trying to make here. If there are times that our heart leads us in a good direction and times that our heart leads us in a bad direction, then we can't rely on the advice, just listen to your heart. Because our own experience tells us that that's not always sound advice. It may take us in the wrong direction. So move on by looking at discussion point number 3. Here you're going to look at a series of Proverbs verses that talk about the human heart. And as you read those verses, they're all going to be different. Some of them are going to speak of the heart as something that can be formed and shaped, into the ways that are pleasing of God. There are going to be some verses that talk about the heart being unreliable, some about the heart being impressionable, all of these things. Once you read all of that, you're to fill in that blank there on discussion point number 1 that says, my heart is blank. And you do that after your group has read all of the different Proverbs, okay? So maybe assign one out to a different person. Then after you've read them all, you're saying, okay, so kind of a composite statement based on everything that we just heard. How would I complete this statement? My heart is blank. So let your group members complete that. And truthfully, the answer ought to be something like this: the heart is confused, or the heart is conflicted, or the heart is mysterious or perplexing, whatever it may be. The whole point is this: the heart is really unreliable. As a guide, as a direction giver, our hearts really can't be relied upon to send us down the wrong path. So when people are making important decisions, to tell them, oh, just listen to your heart and trust your heart, that may end up being very critically bad advice for them, okay? So at this point in your discussion, you've talked about the conflicting nature of the heart. Now look at discussion point number 4. It says Jeremiah tells us that our hearts are deceitfully wicked. In fact, Jeremiah says, above all things, the hearts are deceitfully wicked. Who can figure it out? This means that we have the tendency to lie to ourselves. And by the way, if you're lying to yourself, you don't know that you're being lied to. That's the bad thing about self-deceit. So Jeremiah tells us that our hearts are deceitfully wicked. This means we have a tendency to lie to ourselves. But the Bible also says that God gives us new hearts with God-honoring desires. And there are several verses pointed out there. I would encourage you to go ahead and look those up ahead of time. Just as you're preparing, even when we finish this video, look those up and read what the Bible says about our heart and how there are times that we have desires that are so right and so good that God is eager and willing to give us the desires of our heart. So, the voice, come back to discussion point number 4 here. So the voice we hear coming from our heart might be worth rejecting or it might be worth listening to. So the question is, how can we discern the difference? And that's really where you're trying to get to in this whole discussion. If our hearts aren't necessarily reliable, and they may be giving us good advice, they may be giving us treacherously bad advice, how can we discern the difference? How can we know when we need to listen to our heart or totally reject it altogether? That's going to lead you to James chapter 4. You see that right there on discussion point number 4. James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. And listen to these. I'm going to read them for you. It says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You want something, but you don't get it. You kill and covet, but you cannot have what you want. You quarrel and fight. You do not have because you don't ask God. And when you ask, you don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures." Now, here's what you're going to see here. James is talking about quarrels and fighting. He's talking about outward conflict with others. But what James is showing us is that outward conflict is just the result of an inward conflict that we have. He says, don't you know that you have desires inside of you that are warring against one another? Now, look at discussion point number 5. It says, James points to the conflicting desires found within our hearts. And that's what we talked about a while ago. Sometimes our hearts are leading us to do what's really good and what's right. Sometimes our hearts are leading us to do what's really bad and wrong. The question is, how can we discern the difference? Well, the very fact that James says that we have desires that are warring against one another points us to this reality, that you have God-honoring desires and you have not God-honoring desires, all right? So, James points out the conflicting desires within our hearts, but he also helps us know which is which. And the key is found in verse 3 in our text. And discussion point number 5 directs you to look at verse 3 again and listen to it. I'm going to read it to you again. He says, when you ask God for what you want, you don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. Now, here's the whole key to it. Look at discussion point number 6. When self is the why behind what our heart is telling us, we can know that it's lying to us. Now again, James says there are times you ask God for something and he says, I'm not going to give you that. And he says, why is that? Because your motives have to do with your own pleasures, which is a word for your selfish pleasures, really. So here's what the Bible's telling us. When we have a desire of the heart that begins to tell us what we ought to do, that desire is either going to be a fleshly desire from our sinful nature, or it's going to be a desire birthed from the very heart of God that has been now planted inside of us. How can we know whether it's the heart of God or the heart of ourself? It all comes back to this. Does that desire revolve around self? If it does, then we can reject what our heart is telling us. So look at your discussion point. When self is the why behind what our heart is telling us, we can know that it's lying to us. But if that voice sounds more like Jesus, and there are a couple of examples there in parentheses. For example, if that voice is saying it's better to give than to receive, or if that voice is saying, laying down your life for the good of another, those things sound like Jesus, right? Right. If the voice inside of us sounds more like Jesus, we can know that it's the heart of Christ in us that is speaking. So, how do you discern when the desires of your heart are trying to guide you and lead you? How can you know if that voice is worth listening to or that voice is worth rejecting? We examine our motives. We examine the why behind those desires. And if the why behind those desires is all about me and all about self, then I can know that that is a desire that is a self-deceiving desire. Does that make sense? So that's where you're going with this. Discussion point number 7 simply says this: we must reject life according to me. And by the way, according to me is the name of the new sermon series. We must reject life according to me and embrace life according to him, which leads you to your memory verse, which talks about living according to his voice and his ways. Psalm 119, verse 9. How can a young man keep his way pure? By living according to your word, not according to my word. And I know that my word's going to be all about me and all about self. So living according to your word, that's the way to live, and that's the voice to listen to. All right? So this is what your guide's all about. Again, plan ahead. Just in case discussion point number 1 goes real long, come up with a plan and say, where am I going to jump to if that thing takes up half our time? And you'll do fine. This is going to be a really good discussion, and I hope that you and your group benefit from it a great deal. All right, God bless you. We'll see you Sunday.